Hello, listeners. This is Janine
and Kristen
from Henrico Casa. You are listening to our podcast, Vigilant Voices. Living life every day. Hello, listeners. We're so glad you are here with us today.
We are, and we're at the start of October, which is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So as you can imagine, we're going to use our time together today to chat about how domestic violence affects children.
And right, because as with all of the topics we discuss, we believe that when we know more about the challenges facing children and families, we can work to ensure no child faces continued abuse, neglect, or trauma.
Right. And so for today's episode, it's really important to note that even if domestic violence is between two adults, and sometimes we hear people use the phrase intimate partner violence.
Right. As in, and what we mean by that is just that the violence isn't directed at the children.
Right. But even so, it is still traumatic for the children, right?
Right. Unfortunately, we hear all too often things from parents like, well, yes, we did get a little physical with one another. There was some shouting or arguing, but we weren't violent towards the children.
Yeah.
Or we made sure that the kids didn't see us fighting.
Yeah,
right?
Which, let's be real, kids hear and see everything.
They do. They pick up on a lot. And so at a minimum, that little spidey sense that we all sort of
right.
have. But I do think that that's where, children, they sense when something's not right.
So true. And in today's Casa case story, the children didn't need to draw upon spidey senses, right? They unfortunately saw with their own eyes their parents yelling, hitting, kicking, and spitting at one another. And the police saw it too on numerous occasions. And so this history of domestic violence with police intervention led to Child Protective Services petitioning the court for a protective order. And this order mandated that the parents have no contact with one another in front of their children.
Yeah. And this sounds like right about when CASA would typically be appointed to this case.
Correct. The young children, and I'll call them Brianna and Brian, they were assigned a CASA advocate. And the advocate's immediate responsibility was to help identify a safe home for Brianna and Brian and to report back to the court on their parents' compliance with that no contact order. The parents were to engage in visitation with the children separately, not together.
Which makes total sense in a case like this because, the parents didn't seem to be able to get along in front of the children when it was just the two of them.
Right.
And really, frankly, didn't seem to recognize the damage that was being done to the children.
Yeah. Even though the kids weren't physically being assaulted, right? Damage was being done.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly what we'd like to talk through and focus on today. Just how witnessing domestic violence affects and impacts children.
Yeah.
I think it'd also be helpful if we identify not just some of the short-term effects, but the long-term effects and impact as well.
Definitely. And now let me insert our usual disclaimer that all children are different and they all react to trauma in different ways.
It's very true. And we've talked about ages and stages of development, in our podcast sessions. And so they can also ask differently based on that.
Right. So I guess to get started, thinking of the short-term impact of domestic violence on children, we often see children regress. And what I mean by that is if you think of their age and stage of development, they may revert to behaviors that were associated with a previous
like
stage.
A younger
right?
Stage, right?
Yeah. So like a potty-trained toddler may go back to wetting their bed. Children may stop using their words and instead be whining or crying more. They may have trouble sleeping. They may go back to sucking their thumb. They may go back to experiencing separation anxiety. Those are all like regressions.
Exactly. And, sometimes even the younger kids will complain of like small ailments like, oh, my tummy hurts or I have a headache. But, it's not that they don't, but it's probably their body manifesting, the stress of that trauma.
Sure.
And they don't know how to explain it. So it comes out in this physical way.
Right. They're so tense, their little tummies hurt.
Right.
We also see children feel guilt because they blame themselves for their parents fighting.
Yeah, those are the hardest, sort of most heartbreaking scenarios because it's 100% not their fault. They had nothing to do with it. And so I think the examples that we've shared so far are what we oftentimes see in the younger children. But of course, we serve teens and older youth.
Yep.
And so, when we think about our older children and teens, I think we often see one of two extremes. They either become very withdrawn and depressed and want to isolate themselves, or they really start acting out in pretty big and significantly risky ways.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that acting out can often repeat what they've seen at home.
Right.
So children who have witnessed violence between their parents are at greater risk of being violent in their own present and future relationships.
Exactly. And we definitely see generational cycles of violence, which is just so hard because, it just feels like it's repeating. But if, as advocates for children, we can intervene and stop that cycle. I mean, that's what I consider a major, major win.
Oh, definitely, without a doubt. And I guess that's the long-term impact for children witnessing domestic violence. They are at a greater risk for repeating the cycle as adults, either by entering into abusive relationships or becoming an abuser themselves.
Exactly, because they've mimicked what they saw. And unfortunately, these children are also at higher risk for health problems as adults, which is true for any and all children, as we've talked about, who endure what we call these adverse childhood experiences. And some of those long-term negative outcomes include mental health conditions like anxiety and depression.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? You can kind of see the logical progression between enduring something traumatic like this and then struggling with the emotional or mental health ramifications, right? But what's interesting is that these children are also at a higher risk for various physical health conditions like obesity and diabetes and heart disease.
Right. So the trauma that they endure from living in an unstable home and witnessing violence is referred to as toxic stress in the medical community.
Right.
And it wears on them and really does truly strain these various body systems that then has direct impacts on physical, mental, and then behavioral health as well.
Yeah. And so, listener, this is tough to hear, right? Children are clearly impacted by the decisions the adults in their lives make. And when those adults have violence in their relationship, it affects the kids, whether they're physically assaulted or not. It definitely affects them.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I guess the question then that we would pose is, so what do we do as safe adults in children's lives? Like, what can we do to help?
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, we would suggest to talk to them.
Yeah.
Often domestic violence is hidden or downplayed and sometimes potentially justified by caregivers because of the family situations.
Right.
And that means the children have likely not been made to feel comfortable talking about it.
Right. And so as a safe adult, we need to open that door, but gently, with grace, with empathy, right? And sometimes opening the door just looks like giving them a safe space, which can take time.
Exactly. And so for our advocates, this is where showing up week after week, to visit the children, realistically, it can sometimes take months before they feel safe, right? And that safety feels, evident to them.
And that's okay. We don't want to rush it. Yeah. These children need to feel safe before they will open up. But when they do, make sure you convey that what happened was not their fault.
Right. And give them space and time to share those thoughts and fears because they probably have a lot of fears, or confusion, even if they're now, let's say, living in a different environment or a safe home. They're probably going to have to talk through that.
Definitely. And while you're talking, find ways to explain what healthy relationships look like. Like, they've clearly not witnessed that if they're in this situation. And to break the cycle, they need to know what is and isn't healthy.
I always say, you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
And so I think in this case, if a healthy relationship has never been modeled for them, then these children don't necessarily know what to even look for.
Yeah, how could they?
Right. And so I think we can help lay that foundation for their future relationships.
Yeah. And a big part of healthy relationships is establishing healthy boundaries, right? And so we need to be telling these children that no one has a right to make them feel uncomfortable with words, with touch.
Right.
And that extends to our loved ones and authority figures.
Right.
You, child, have a right to tell someone to stop. And in a healthy relationship, they should do so right away.
And if they, don't stop, then they should absolutely tell a safe person whom, they believe is safe in their life.
Right. And if you've been putting the time and effort into building a relationship with that child, hopefully you're that safe person.
Right. And, one more thing we can do to help these children is to make sure they have a support system moving forward, because they will continue to need help processing in maybe the short term, but also likely the long term.
Yeah, and they will likely need help creating and maintaining those healthy boundaries and healthy relationships.
So true. The support system can also include like informal and formal relationships. Friends, family, coaches, mentors. But of course, if needed, absolutely professionals, like counselors or therapists.
Yes. And a support system was key for Brianna and Brian in today's Casa Case story. Their advocate helped pursue mental health evaluations for the children and then connected them with the follow-up services that each one required, while also helping them reconnect with various relatives who were positive influences in the children's lives. In addition, this advocate encouraged the parents individually to attend counseling and support groups.
Great.
And while the parents were not able to be the primary caregivers for the children, they still needed support. And Casa wanted the children to see them making strides towards a healthier relationship.
Yes. And I choose to believe that the children, seeing their parents, right, work on better communication.
Yeah.
Probably some anger management, and other things, will leave a mark, right? That's positive progress. And so these children will look for those positive characteristics in future relationships. That's a goal.
Yeah, agreed. These little ones witnessed the abuse. And in the same way, they will witness the transformation of their parents as they all accept help together.
Yeah, love that. And so as we wrap up this episode, I think our call to action should be for everyone to familiarize ourselves with the various ways that someone can report domestic violence. I think is good.
Sure, definitely. Because I know I've learned that the reality is we can endanger a victim of abuse if we jump into action like in the wrong way, right? And we don't ever want to put someone in danger. Often abusers are, tracking phones or their spouse's locations, et cetera. And so to get help, a victim needs to request it in the safest way possible.
And so we would encourage you to visit the domestic violence hotline to see the many options available for seeking help. That call, chat, text are all accepted. And can we link to that?
Yeah, I'll definitely put it in the show notes.
And there are really a whole lot of tips on the site for things like how someone might clear their browser history if they're scared, that, let's say, internet activity is being monitored.
Yeah. And, we have to keep these nuances in mind as we offer to help someone, because we want to approach it in the safest way possible. And we want to keep in mind that as hard as it is to know, on average, it takes 7 attempts before a victim of domestic violence can safely leave their abuser for good.
Yeah.
So to be supportive, it requires you being present, you being patient, you being empathetic.
And be there for them when they are ready.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to Vigilant Voices, Henrico Casa's new podcast. We have a vision for all children to live in safe, healthy homes. You can help us make that happen. Tell a friend about our podcast and find us on social media.
I believe in the better days.